Now, when we talk about platforms, we often hear about Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple. We often hear about the big tech companies. And very often, I remember Brian's slide this morning, that's a common thing that a lot of executives say, that that innovation is not for us, it's not for our industry. But what's happening right now is increasingly over the last 5 years in particular, we are seeing platform business models come up in all industries. And to know where you are in that industry spectrum, it's helpful to understand that there are two primary factors that determine when platforms enter a certain industry. The first is how resistant is the industry to digitization. Is it a traditional industry, or is it an industry where there's a lot of digitization that's already happened? And the second is how regulated is that particular industry. So if we look at this simple framework, a lot of the companies, a lot of the industries that got initially digitized, media, telecom, where content applications were the main source of value, or even retail, a lot of the industries that got digitized 20 years back are the ones that have been fully impacted by platform businesses. But going forward, we are seeing, especially in Europe, massive deregulation in the banking industry with the Payment Services Directive, or in the healthcare industry, which is leading to platforms in banking and healthcare as well today. And if you think about the rise of sensors, the digitization of machine performance, of business processes, we are increasingly going to see platforms, and we're already seeing platforms coming up in traditional industries like construction, mining, supply chains. All traditional industries as well are now moving towards platform-based business models. So if we look at this, this overall framework, what we see is that around 5 years back, you could still have gotten away by saying that our industry is not towards the bottom left, our industry is on the top right or on the bottom right. But today, all these industries are getting impacted by platform business models. What we see very often is that when an industry starts moving towards platforms, companies need to start choosing what positions they play in that industry. So if we think about what kinds of positions companies can play in an industry that's impacted by platforms, again, I'd think about a simple framework over here, that as we move towards platforms and as we think about an economy that is increasingly digital, increasingly information-centric, there are two core assets that you need to think about. One is, do you own the critical IP in your industry? Do you own the critical intellectual property that others require in your industry? And the second is, and intellectual property could even be data. When I use the term intellectual property, I'm not talking about patents and copyrights. I'm talking about any form of information-based asset around which you can create value in the digital economy. The first thing is, do you own the intellectual property that's valuable in your industry? And the second thing is, do you have access to the end user? So if you think of these two simple parameters, if you have neither of these parameters, then you end up becoming commoditized in the long run. Because in the traditional pipeline business, you could still have a strong business if you had strong customer relationships. But as an industry becomes more connected, becomes more digitized, as business processes become more digital and there's more transparency about which service providers are performing well, which ones are not performing well, the traditional advantages of an opaque industry start going away. And so what we start seeing is, as an industry becomes more digitized, if you have neither the critical intellectual property nor the distribution advantage, then you end up in a position where the business becomes a commodity. There's a second position where businesses can be distribution partners. So if you think about a company like Samsung, it may not own the operating system, but it distributes the operating system of Android to the end user. So Samsung becomes a very important distribution partner and hence creates a very successful business around Android as an operating system. And this is where a whole range of new handset manufacturers came in and started competing and outdid companies like Nokia, because Nokia's traditional advantage in IP started going down, and Android essentially concentrated all of the IP in the industry by creating the App Store, where all the applications moved towards Android. And that allowed companies like Samsung to come up as distribution partners and become successful as part of the Android ecosystem. The next thing that's important is that if you own critical intellectual property, you could be a capability provider to other companies. Today, Google is in that enviable position where Google owns Google Maps, which is a central requirement for two industries. One is the handset industry, and the other is the self-driving car industry. A car cannot self-drive unless it has good mapping data. And Google has the central most important capability that allows self-driving cars to self-drive. And it's because of this single capability that Google can successfully play as a capability provider in multiple different industries. And in a few cases, when you have both the most important intellectual property and you have the access to the market, you could become the platform for that industry as well. So if you look at Facebook, Facebook has the most important intellectual property, all of our data, and it has access to all the users, which is why it is able to become the central platform for the media industry, and all advertisers start coming to Facebook. And so when we look at where things are headed, companies will have to choose positions across these four positions. If you look at Android as an example, Google plays the platform owner with Android. Google has the most important capability with Google Maps. Samsung acts as a distribution partner, and all the telcos become a commodity given this ecosystem scenario, because they neither own the IP nor do they uniquely own distribution, because users now have a relationship either with Samsung or directly through the App Store with Google. So if you look at this whole structure, my point is that as the world moves towards platforms, companies will have to place multiple bets, very specifically aiming for one of these three positions to avoid becoming commoditized.